You may be seated. There's an error in your bulletin as to the scripture verses. Instead of Matthew 6, it's supposed to be Matthew 5. I think it'll make a whole lot more sense now when you hear this. So Exodus 20, we get the 3 commandments we're going to look at today. It says, honor your father and your mother so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God has given you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. Now in Matthew chapter 5, starting with verse 21, Jesus weighs in on these on the Sermon on the Mount when he says, you have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. So Jesus is referring not only to Exodus 20, but also to the story of Noah. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, you fool, you will be liable to the hell of fire. Then down to verse 27. You have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her heart. We're going to look at commandments 5, 6, and 7 today. I know last week I told you we were going to look at 5 all the way through 10, and I couldn't do it. There's just too much stuff here, and so I needed to break it up a little bit for you. The first 4 commandments that we looked at last week are primarily dealing with our relationship with God. The next 6 commandments are going to deal primarily with our relationship with other people and then our relationship with property. Now, I know last week I told you that these 10 commandments, that they are ambiguous. And I didn't want you to hear that term ambiguous meaning that they're wishy-washy or that they're vague or that they don't mean what they say. Commandments are very clear as to what they mean. And I'm convinced that God gave these commandments to Moses, who gave them to us in such a manner that the ambiguity is intentional because it makes us think. We have to ask, what does it mean to murder? What does it mean to commit adultery? What does it mean to honor our mother and our father? And when you have to think about those things, then it means that the commandments, rather than ever going out of style, it means that we constantly have to be thinking about them and updating them and seeing how they relate to how we are living in our world today. So the thou shalt not never goes out of style. It's always a prohibition that this is wrong. Sin is still sin. Hasn't ever changed. We've heard the phrase, you've all heard the phrase, the more things change, the more. That's true. Our technology may change, but sin has not changed. We are still doing the same things wrong that they did in the days of Noah, that they did in the days of Moses, that they did during the days of Judges, that they did during the days of Jesus. Sin has not changed. The meaning and the application of the 10 Commandments for our world has not changed either. So let's look at the first one that we're going to look at today, which is to honor our mother and our father. Now, Commandments 5 and 6 fall into what I call the yes-but zone. And what I mean by that is we say, honor our mother and father, yes, but. We always have a something, right? But what if my parents were abusive? Thou shalt not murder. Yes, but what if my life is threatened? So we always think of these extenuating circumstances. Now, I think I've told you before that my parents were Ward and June Cleaver. And they were. They were absolutely wonderful. And so this commandment, honor your mother and your father so that it might go well for you in the land in which you live, that was an easy commandment for me to keep. I was Wally. Now, I had an older sister, but I was Wally. I was the dutiful firstborn son. I did the things that I was supposed to do. I was a very compliant child. I wasn't rebellious or obnoxious. But, here's the but, is that later in life, I came to the awareness that there were an awful lot of kids who grew up whose parents were not Ward and June Cleaver. That they grow up in difficult circumstances. I remember when I was a junior in high school, one of my classmates, a young girl, came to school and she had heavy makeup on her eye, cover up a black eye. And one of my friends told me that it was because her dad hit her. I thought he was lying. I couldn't imagine, I couldn't wrap my mind around the fact that a father would hit his daughter. And so I had rose-colored glasses because of my upbringing, which is great, by the way. But I realize now that there are people who, when they hear honor your mother and father, they go, yes, but. They're concerned about the but part. So what's actually happening here? Well, it says, honor your mother and your father, and the word honored there in the Hebrew, it's the word kabid. Now, the amazing thing about this is we've already looked at the word kabid once before, in that it means heavy or weighted. And it's the same word that was used to describe Pharaoh's heart. Pharaoh's heart was kabid. It was heavy. And so we read that as that Pharaoh's heart was stubborn, and we think that that's a negative thing. But in the Hebrew tense in which the word kabid is being used in this context, it still means heavy or weighted, but what it means is to give gravity to your parents. Now, when we say that something has gravitas, something that has weight to it, that means honor. It means that we have respect for them, that we give substance to who they are and what they're saying. And so that's how the word kabid is being used in this context, is that we are to give weight or honor or respect to our parents. Now, the cultural context in which this verse is found is that it is addressing adult sons. It's not talking to adolescents or grade school children. It's talking to adult sons. Sons who are in their 20s to their 40s and whose parents are getting elderly. This is the welfare verse in the Old Testament. When it says that sons are to honor or to respect their parents, what it is saying is that when your parents go from being an economic asset and instead become an economic liability, you do not discard them. It means just because your parents are getting old, you still listen to their counsel. Even when you are able to make your own decisions, you still give weight to their experience and to the advice that they are giving you. That's sorely lacking in our society today, isn't it? In fact, by extension, you could take this verse and it would apply to anybody, young or old, the unborn to the elderly, anybody who has gone from being an economic asset and has become a liability, to realize that we are not to discard them. We are not to push them aside or want to get rid of them. One of the reasons why we have abortion. Having a baby that I don't want is a liability, so I eliminate it. We don't want to have to deal with the elderly, so we warehouse them. We don't want to have to deal with people who are in wheelchairs, who are crippled, who are injured, because they're a liability. We don't want to have that responsibility for them. And what this commandment is saying is that you do not do that to human beings, because they are human beings created in the image of God. Now, the interesting thing about this is there is the exact opposite verse in Leviticus, where we are told that if a child or a son, mainly it's talking to an adult son, dishonors his parents, that he is to be put to death. Now, I don't know if Moses is using hyperbole, literally wanting them to be put to death, or whether he was just making a point that this is a very serious issue. But the word that's used there for dishonor is the word ga'al. I think that's right. Q-A-L-A-L, which literally means to make light, which is just the opposite of kabid, which is to make heavy. And so it's to dishonor your parents is to have nothing to do with them, that they have no weight, they have no gravity in your life, that they have no aspect that you pay any attention to. So that's what it means to dishonor. Now, Victor Hamilton, who's one of the main scholars that I've been looking at in our study of Exodus, he makes the point that this verse is found in Leviticus 20, verse 9, and it is the first of 12 prohibitions, and the next 12 are all illicit sexual encounters. And so he's thinking, why in the world would you have anybody who dishonors your mother and father, and then you have this whole list of you should not have sex with, and it lists all of these various people or situations. And what Victor Hamilton has come up with, and I think he's right on this, is he says that if we don't get the parental relationship right, we don't understand what it means to honor our mother and our fathers, that just opens the door to screwing up all the rest of the relationships that we get involved with. That if we can't figure out how to get along with our parents, and if parents can't figure out how to be decent parents for their children, then it messes up all the other relationships that we have. And so you have all kinds of illicit sexual activity, and you just start down a terrible, terrible path. Billy Graham's the one who said this. A child who is allowed to be disrespectful to his parents will have no respect for anyone else. We can't get the parental relationship right. You become self-centered. You see people as things to be used, utilitarian, as opposed to being to serve each other. And that's how you end up with all the illicit sexual activity. You see people as an object for my pleasure, rather than somebody that I'm supposed to honor and respect because they're created in the image of God. Now, the implications for this sin are enormous, aren't they? Because what it means for children, adult children, and also for young children, it means that if we get this wrong, if we don't know how to honor our parents, if we don't learn how to honor our parents, then it just sends us on a road to destruction. Just horrible things begin to happen for us. And that we can't get our relationships right, and we start down a path of broken relationships. And isn't that what we see in our world today? All kinds of broken relationships. But on the positive side of this thing is that when we learn how to honor our parents, good things happen to us, which is why it says that this is the commandment that we might dwell long in the land, that we might do well. So how do we honor our parents? Well, there's lots of things that we can do, but there's two that I want to point out. The first one is obedience, and the second one is gratitude. Now, obedience is more for the line of adolescents and younger children. Be obedient. To do what your parents say. To mind them. Now, here's one of the yes, but parts again. Some of you have had, or are, what Dr. James Dobson called strong-willed children. Oh, I'm so no, never had one of those before. Dr. Dobson makes the point that for strong-willed children, obedience is actually outside of their abilities. They are just wired in such a way that they will challenge your authority all the time. And for them to obey, it's just more than they can do. And so it means that there's lots of tears, both with the parents and with the children, and how to work with this. But the amazing thing about these strong-willed children is that if they live, if you don't kill them before they reach about the age of 20, they come out of that. And they are able to understand the sacrifices, the hardship of their parents to raise them. So strong-willed children will really test you, but okay. Good things come out of it at the end of it. But as adult children, what we need to do is we need to show gratitude. We need to tell our parents, thank you. We need to forgive our parents for the mistakes that they made, because all parents make mistakes. We're not perfect people. And parents, I've made mistakes with my children, and I know that my kids, they tease me about it. Oh, Dad, you were terrible with this. I was a Nazi in the car, remember? We'd drive 400 miles before we'd have a bathroom break. They've forgiven me for that. Thank you, Jesus. And we need to do that, but we need to show gratitude to our parents. Mark Twain is the one who, I think was Mark Twain, who said this, that he said that when he was a child, his parents could do no wrong. He said that when he got to his teens, his dad was an idiot, dumbest man in the world. When he got into his 20s, his dad was still pretty stupid, but his intelligence was starting to go up. When he got into his 30s and his 40s, his dad was pretty smart. By the time when Mark Twain was in his 50s, his dad was a genius. Age gives us perspective, doesn't it? And when we age, we begin to realize that our parents actually did have our best interests at heart. They weren't as stupid as we thought they were. It's amazing. This is what I miss most about my dad. Is I wish I could still call my dad and get advice on what's it like to be 60. How do you become a better grandparent? How do you do some of these things? And I don't have that opportunity now to ask for his advice. And that's something that I miss. But that's what it means, to honor our parents. Applications now are the implication for what it means to be a parent. It means you have great responsibility as a parent of children, don't you? And so Ephesians, Paul in his letter to the Ephesians, here's what he writes to the husbands. He says, do not provoke your children to anger. And what Paul is talking about there is that there's a difference between disciplining our children because they have done something which makes us look bad. So what I'm doing is I'm disciplining because they've embarrassed me, as opposed to disciplining your children because the correction they need is in order to make them a better person. You don't discipline out of anger or what they have done that makes you look bad. You discipline as to what will help your children to be better people. The best way that you teach your children is when you model for them good and appropriate behavior. When you play with your children, when you love your children, when you encourage them instead of discouraging them, when you are proud of them and you tell them that you are proud of them, when they see you honoring your spouse and your parents, your kids are going to want to be like you. They will do what you do. Like I said, this commandment was easy for me to do because I was loved by my parents and praised by them, and it was an easy thing to do. But now the yes, but. What if my parents were terrible? How do I honor my parents if they were alcoholics, or if they were abusive, or if they were disrespectful to each other? Do I still have to honor them? Yes, you do. It's still a commandment. God said, honor your mother and your father. Now here's the caution that I would say about this, is that we are under authority. God has put us under parental authority in order to shape our character. But God has not put us under authority in order to be abused. And if you are in an abusive situation, this is where the church comes in. And as Christians, we need to step in to those situations where there is abuse. Men in this church need to step up and to be a father to the fatherless. Women already do a pretty good job of stepping up and being mothers and grandmothers to those who don't have that. But we need to stop abuse, step in, to report it, to prevent it. Now, one of the things that was most challenging about Mother Teresa, but admirable, is that she spoke out very strongly against abortion. We all knew that. But what she would also say is, give me your children. If you don't want them, I'll take them. She didn't just speak words, she followed it up with action. And we need to do that as the church. Not enough just to say that abuse is wrong. We need to step up and be a court advocate for children, to be reporters, be willing to be foster parents. Step in. Say, give the children to me. You're not going to raise them in a way that would elicit respect and honor. Second commandment. Actually, number 6. You shall not murder. Now, one of the things that I find amazing is that the order of these commandments, there is just as much truth in the order in which we get the commandments as in the individual commandments themselves. And that this commandment, you shall not murder, notice what it follows. You shall honor your mother and your father, a positive commandment. And then it comes just before, you shall not commit adultery. If I get the relationship right with my parents, if I get my relationship right with God, the first 4 commandments, I am less likely to have problems with my temper, which would lead to murder, and it means I'm less likely to murder my relationship with my spouse and with these other things. These commandments, they flow together because that's the way that God created us and the way that these things are supposed to work. And so if I honor my parents, I get my marriage right. So I don't mess up with the adultery thing and I don't have the violent aspects of it. Now, the ambiguous word here that we look at in this commandment is the Hebrew word resah. And what the wondering is, what does this word mean? Does it mean to kill or does it mean to murder? Now, the simple solution would be if the word resah literally meant murder with malice aforethought, premeditative. The Hebrew has 3 words, harag, mut, and katal, which all mean kill or manslaughter. No intent. It was an accident. I killed somebody, but I didn't mean to, and so they'll use the word harag. Or my axe flies off of my handle and strikes somebody and kills them. So I mut him. I never intended to kill him. It just happened. And so it would, we would like that the word resah would mean to have premeditative and to kill them. Most of the time, that's what it means, but not always. Sometimes it shows up as meaning manslaughter, no intent. Most of the time, the context in which it's used in that way is when it's talking about cities of refuge, which is if you accidentally kill somebody, you flee to these cities of refuge in order to be protected. But most scholars, giving you more information than you want, right? Most scholars think that resah usually implies that you intended, that it was premeditative. And so it hits our definition of what we consider to be murder, which is you have to have motive. It has to be premeditated. That's how you would get a murder conviction if somebody comes to trial. It has to be a motive. It has to be premeditative. Malice aforethought is what they would call that. So here's what the yes buts are. It means that if somebody is attacking me and I defend myself and I kill them, that's not murder. It wasn't premeditated. I'm not violating this commandment. It means that if I'm a soldier in war and I'm in combat and I kill somebody, there was no malice intended. There was no premeditative thing. I'm following my duty. I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. So I killed, but I didn't murder. Means the death penalty, that if you were the one who has to administer the lethal injection, there was no malice aforethought, you're doing what the state says that you needed to do, and so you're not guilty of murder. So most of those yes but questions we have are resolved if we think that you have to have the premeditative part of it. The problem, though, is that Jesus weighs in on this commandment. And what he says when he weighs in on this thing is he expands the meaning to attitude and to verbal. And that he says that if you are angry with somebody, you've murdered them. That if you curse somebody, taking the third commandment, using the Lord's name in order to harm somebody, you are guilty of murder. What Jesus does is he backs up the sixth commandment to the premeditative part. It's when you're thinking about it that you are already committing the crime of murder. You've heard the phrase, if looks could kill? I'm a serial killer. Now, I don't know how many people from Indiana I wanted to kill yesterday who were playing football, but there was, I mean, if looks could kill. And Jesus would say that looks do kill, that they do kill. That when we have those kinds of thoughts and that kind of anger that builds up in us, that we kill people in our mind and with our tongue long before we ever kill them with our hands. Isn't that true? Have you ever been that angry? Fortunately, I really haven't, but I know that some of you are, that you have been that angry that came this close to wanting to do great harm to somebody. That's what Jesus is talking about. And so, the positive aspect of this commandment would be to respect life, to respect other human beings, because we are created in the image of God. So how do these commandments fit together? Well, if you put God first, if you don't try to control God, if you don't use God's name to harm others, and if you orient your life around God, and if you have your parental relationships right, you're probably going to respect life, and you're probably going to respect your marriage. So you won't have the next problem. Do not commit adultery. It follows murder, and it precedes stealing. There's a reason for that. It's because adultery murders the relationships. It drives a dagger through matrimony. It steals. It steals affection from the spouse who's supposed to be getting the affection. And it leads to lying, which is the 9th commandment, because you're living a lie. And it leads to the 10th commandment, which is coveting, when you begin to desire somebody else's spouse for yourself because you see them utilitarian, because you don't see people as having value and respect and to be honored. The interesting thing is in the book of Proverbs, I can't give you the verse because I didn't write it down, but in the book of Proverbs, the adulterer is condemned not because they're sinning against God, but because they're an idiot. Proverbs basically says that anybody who commits adultery is a moron, that they're just incredibly stupid. The word they use is fool. You are a fool because you are setting yourself up for a vengeance from the spouse that you have stolen the affection from. So it's basically, thou shalt not be an idiot, is what the book of Proverbs tells us about adultery. Now, adultery in Jesus' day and in Moses' day was gender specific. Now, this is irritating to me. It could be irritating to you. But in Jesus' day, only a married woman could commit adultery. That sound fair? Not. But in Jesus' day, if a married man has an affair with an unmarried woman, that's not adultery. That's just stupidity. If a married man has an affair with a married woman, then it's adultery. And if a married woman has an affair with anybody outside of her husband, single or married, it's adultery. So it's a gender-specific thing. But when Jesus weighs in on this thing, he's thrown all that away. Jesus is not gender-specific. Adultery is the violating of the marital relationship, but Jesus actually even expands this thing to any sort of sexual relationship prior to or outside of the marriage bounds. And so Jesus then backs up just like he backed up the timeline on when murder happens, he backs up the timeline on when adultery happens. He says that when you begin to look at people with lustful eyes, and what he means by lustful eyes is when you see people in a utilitarian fashion, that they are for your pleasure, for what you want, rather than seeing them with respect and honor, that's when adultery begins. Now, there's a difference between looking at somebody and admiring their beauty and looking at somebody and undressing them in your mind. The lustful looking thing. So I'm going to sound like a grumpy grandpa here for a while, okay? In our society today, pornography has become so prevalent that I really can't describe it. In my day, okay, here's why I sound like the grumpy grandpa. In my day, if you wanted to look at pornography, you had to go into a convenience store and buy it. Or you had to buy a videotape. And so you risked being exposed, being discovered, and it cost money. And so that's a pretty good deterrent, actually. You didn't want anybody to see you buying that stuff, and so you went into it. But nowadays, it's free. It's anonymous, and it's 2 clicks away on your computer. The result of, in fact, Playboy doesn't even do nudie pictures anymore because they can't compete with the free stuff that's on the internet. So they stopped doing it. Did you hear that? Did you read that in the newspaper about a month ago or so? They can't compete anymore because it's free out there. Our society has become so sexually overcharged and contextualized that our society has become immodest. When you watch music performers, anywhere from Beyonce to Taylor Swift to any of these things, Miley Cyrus, they're not wearing anything. And very suggestive and revealing clothing. The television commercials, men and women, everything they're wearing or not wearing sends a very strong message, doesn't it, about sexuality. You have to be careful now when you go to the YMCA to work out because of the attire that's being worn by young and not so young men and women there. And our society has just simply become immodest. We don't see that as an issue. I have great sympathy for teenage boys and young men in our society today because it's unavoidable. And young women, when you dress in suggestive manners, you cause young men to stumble. Some of the young men, with the way that they're dressing, and not so young men, they're causing the young ladies to have thoughts and things which are inappropriate. I'm sounding like a grumpy old man, right? But I think I'm speaking truth. And so one of the things that we need to do if we're going to help people not commit adultery in their mind, as well as physically, is we need to rediscover modesty. We need to dress appropriately. We need to behave appropriately. Sex and sexuality is a gift that God gave us. God's not sitting up there in heaven looking down at human beings going, my, what will they think of next? That was his invention. But it's like a river. And a river, when it's in its banks, is powerful and it's beautiful. But when a river floods, it's devastating and it's destructive. And when sex gets outside of the boundaries of marriage, either before sex, after sex, or after, before marriage, after marriage, extramarital, it destroys things. Destroys families, destroys individuals, destroys children, destroys churches, destroys community. People begin to take sides as to what's happening with the affairs, the adultery. So what we need to do is we need to honor marriage. We need to put boundaries around it to protect it. And we need to encourage abstinence for marriage and fidelity within marriage. You see, God doesn't want what's good. He wants what's best. He wants what's best for us. So here's what the commandments are so far that we've looked at. Keep God first. That's number one. Don't try to control God, because that's what images do. You make images. Don't misuse, trivialize, or use God's name to harm others. That's the third one. Don't use the Lord's name in vain. Acknowledge God's sovereignty by resting. That's what happens when we take and observe Sabbath, as we orient our life around God and acknowledge His sovereignty. Honor and respect the parental relationship, because if you get that one right, you're going to get the rest of them right. Honor and respect life. Not just don't kill. Honor and respect life. Honor and respect marriage and the gift of sexuality that God has given. Let us pray.